Welcome back. The House of Commons has risen for the holiday break, with MPs not set to return back here to Ottawa until the end of January. What defined each federal party in 2023? For much of this year, housing and the cost of living crisis dominated debate on Parliament Hill. Facing slumping support, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and the Liberal government have tried to focus more on those issues through a cabinet shuffle, more housing measures, and threats to grocery store chains to stabilize food prices. The Tories, meanwhile, focused on the cost of living early in the year and saw their lead on the Liberals in public opinion polls reach the double digits by late fall. The NDP's deal to keep the Liberals in power is still going strong, with the party's dental care policy front and center, but the NDP does remain roughly where it was in those same polls a year ago. So what did the parties get right this year, and where did they stumble? Our Sunday strategy session is here. Kathleen Monk is a former NDP strategist and director of communications to the late Jack Layton. Corey Tonight was Ontario Premier Doug Ford's campaign manager and former director of communications for Prime Minister Stephen Harper. And Scott Reid is a CTV News political analyst and former communications director to Prime Minister Paul Martin. Hello, everyone. Nearly at the end here. Scott, I'm going to start with you. We're going to go through what the parties, we're going to start off with what you think the parties did right, and we'll ask you to pick what you think the Liberals did right this year.
Well, I've got the easiest job of all three of us because there's so few options to pick from.
Oh, no.
I'll start with the cabinet shuffle, which I thought was a bust in terms of re-energizing the government and resetting its agenda, which was its professed purpose. But one important thing emerged from it. They put Sean Fraser in charge of housing. Housing is right at the center of the storm over cost of living and affordability. And since his appointment, Sean Fraser has been the bright light of this cabinet and this government. He is the Energizer Bunny, making announcements almost on a weekly, daily basis sometimes on housing. He's brought real credibility and real creativity to the file. And I would say that he is a bright spot where they need a bright spot. So that would be my choice for what the Liberals got right in 2023. But there ain't a whole heck of a lot to choose from.
Corey, do you agree with the sentiment around Minister Fraser? And then I'll get your take for what you think the Tories did right.
I think he's certainly been a bright spot in the Liberal team this fall. But I agree with Scott. It's it's a dim light when that's what you're pointing to, because I think the larger framing issues are really where they've been losing the battle, and this is one element of, I think, a larger narrative. But they really got to piece the rest of it together too. But certainly a bright spot. I would agree with that. In terms of the Conservatives, I think they did a number of things right. Most importantly, they got out ahead of the Liberals in terms of branding their leader and introducing him to Canadians in I think a very positive way with a very effective ad campaign. You've seen a lift in the Conservative numbers, I think, as a result. And I think the other element is almost laser-like focused on affordability issues going into the summer, so probably more starting in the summer, to be honest, and then focus on the carbon tax. They took advantage of some, I think, missteps around the removal of home heating fuel in isolation in Atlantic Canada. I think that was a big miss on the Liberal part, and the Conservatives certainly capitalized on it. So I think that focus on the economy and the introduction of Polyev through their advertising campaign are two really big bright spots for them.
Kathleen, your thoughts on the big ad buy that started over the summer, the framing of the Tories leader, and then what you think the NDP did right this year?
Yeah, for sure. I think Corey's right. The Conservatives did have a masterful summer campaign in terms of not only the ad rollout, but frankly, their party discipline is something that all parties should pay attention to, and in terms of how their caucus sticks together on issues that could potentially be wedged against them. And their message consistency is something that is admirable, and I wish other parties would consider adopting. In terms of the NDP, what they did right, I think it's really delivering for Canadians, which sounds like a message track, but I want to point out that things that they have done, whether it's the GST rebates on groceries or particularly the first expansion of healthcare with the dental care plan. This is something that most governments don't get to achieve. It's hard to overstate the importance of dental care, and frankly, governments of all stripes have not been able to expand healthcare for some time. So have the fourth party do that in this House is pretty admirable.
Scott, I'll get your take on the NDP policy wins, and then if you could flag what you think the Liberals did wrong this year.
Well, I remain a big skeptic on the whole NDP will harvest the credit from these gains, and I'm not even convinced that some of these gains are gains. I do think that the dental program is going to make a real difference in people's lives. And once we get past the partisan politics of it now, 10, 20, 15 years, 50 years from now, I think it's going to be a difference maker and something important. In terms of what the Liberals got wrong, I've got to sort of pull a page out of Corey's book. It's the reverse of Corey's answer about the Conservatives, and that is that the Liberals needed to define Pierre Poilievre out of the blocks. They needed to tell Canadians who this new leader of the opposition was, where he comes from, what he's all about, and they needed to do it on their terms. They did not do an ad buy like the Conservatives. They did not get ahead of the Conservatives. They didn't even get behind the Conservatives. They didn't even follow the Conservatives. There's been, to this date, no effort to define Pierre Poilievre other than social media and holding scruns in the House of Commons. It isn't working. It didn't work. And it gave him a huge head start in terms of defining himself. And that's what really kickstarted those polls. So that was a big miss, like a monster big miss of 2023.
Corey, your thoughts on, I mean, they are just doing it on social media right now. They are doing it in the House of Commons, but they certainly have started doing more in those arenas than they had previously. And in some, isolated polls that we've seen so far, we don't know if it's going to stick around. There is a bit of an effect of that.
Yeah, well, it's better to do something than nothing, although I would say what they're doing is pretty tepid. Like the reality of most people's lives and how they consume media right now is that you really have to go to folks through paid advertising if you want to reach those shoulder voters, the voters who are the lowest levels of engagement, who often decide election campaigns, and they're not out looking for political news. You got to really inject it into their feed, so to speak. And so, things that you're doing that are not backed up by dollars, I'm just very skeptical about their efficacy in a modern political marketing world. So, I think it's a big miss. I agree. That's, that combined with a lack of a cohesive narrative that everybody's on. We've seen several examples over the past year where you've got, the prime minister out saying that, our fiscal situation is the strongest in the world. And then you got the minister of finance saying, but we need belt tightening because it's maybe not so great. And then you've got somebody else saying, open the checkbook, we're going to spend. So I I think there's a lack of consistency in narrative there. In terms of the Conservatives, I think the only partial marks I take off their scorecard this year is I think they got a little too focused on the foreign electoral interference storyline in the spring. And you saw their numbers sort of flatline for a few months when that was sucking up all the oxygen in the room. And while, that's clearly an important issue from a substantive point of view, it's not an issue that's really top of mind for Canadians who are worried about cost of living pressures and renegotiating their mortgage or things of that nature, which just on that triage go to the very top right away. So when they got back on those subjects, combined with the advertising campaign, I think it really took off for them. But, a bit of loss of focus from the regular folks towards the Ottawa bubble in the spring. And thankfully, they put that behind them. It's
interesting, Kathleen, I'll get you back to that and then talk about the NDP. Somebody was pointing out to me that the Tories and the Liberals were within 2 points of each other in May. After 5 months of that story dominating the headlines. Once the headlines moved off, the polls did too.
Yeah, they did. But I actually think that, Corey, I mean, if you're looking at the full year, when you want to say where the Conservatives went wrong, I think I would take the points out or mark the report card down on the last 3 weeks. I think really the last 3 weeks, half November and into December, they really stumbled with that vote on against the Ukraine trade deal. They kind of lost their focus. Maybe they ran out of steam in terms of, the shenanigans in the House of the last few weeks, and we've seen them drop. We've seen a 9-point swing just in the last few weeks, where that largely seems to be attributed to that strategic stumble on Ukraine. So I think I would say, if you're looking back on the year for the Conservatives, that's where I said they kind of fell off their game and kind of got distracted. In terms of New Democrats, it builds on something that Scott said earlier. I think the policy is right around dental care and obviously all the other policies that they're working forward with the confidence and supply agreement, but are they getting noticed, New Democrats? I think that's where they're going wrong. Can they actually get the credit for all the work that they're doing? Frankly, the government's better at taking credit and the Conservatives are better at opposing and screaming at the government. And so where does this kind of New Democratic voice fit in? And they need to do a better job of that and putting their leader out in the window more so.
Okay, I'm going to leave it there. And we will regroup next week for our final show of the season. Thank you so much. I appreciated it. Scott Reed, Corey Tenike, and Kathleen Monk.